it's now my pleasure to introduce you to our first item, which is an item stolen from the BBC, Hard Talk. And I'm going to introduce you to Frances Robinson, the journalist. She was at the Wall Street Journal, still writes the Wall Street Journal, has been quartered in Brussels. So if there's anyone who knows the EU inside out, it's Frances. So, hello, and
Hi,
how is it? Because you've come back to London now from being in Brussels.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. I've spent 4.5 years in Brussels, completely involved in this debate, day to day, following it for the Journal. And now, back in the UK, it's like I've gone through the looking glass, because it's the same questions, but very different answers.
And why is it that we Brits are always doing this sort of thing?
I don't know. Is it because we're bossy? I just feel like we could present
if we
Eurovision
are bossy,
up here.
ladies and gentlemen, we are 99% Mary Poppins and only 1% Margaret Thatcher. And on that,
Perfect.
Introduce our guest.
Lovely. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you know that today we were meant to have Commission Vice President Andrus Ansip in from Estonia. However, living in Belgium, he's been inspired by their world-famous record of road cycling and went for a bike ride. In the 42nd kilometre, unfortunately, he swerved, fell off, broke his arm. So let's wish him a speedy recovery and say hello to Robert Madelin, who's the Director General of DG Connect, who I'm sure can do an excellent job of answering all of our questions. Robert, please come up.
Hello.
Perfect. Hey, how are you? Good. All comfy for the hard talk?
Yes.
Lovely. Perfect. Just a quick reminder, you can see the lovely Twitter wall. You can tweet your questions. Jakub will sort them out. About halfway through the session, I'll open up to the floor. So get ready with your questions. Remember, question doesn't mean statement. Keep it short. Keep it simple. Tell us who you are and where you're from, and then you can join in as well. So let's start gently. It's been 6 weeks since you set out the plan for the digital single market. What's the initial reception been like? What are your first thoughts?
So I think the first thing to say is that we started on this well beyond the 6th of May. After Mr. Juncker made the digital single market one of his top 10 priorities, we were getting input from all the national governments already. 20 of the 28 member states told us what was on their minds, and as a result, I think they weren't so surprised on the 6th of May. So the reaction since then has been, I think, largely positive to say, this is the right agenda, can you really do all these proposals in 18 months? But the real test will come at the end of next week at the European Council. Will the heads of government say, this is okay, get on with it, or will they have things to add?
Yeah, great, because you were saying yesterday, sort of praised the work of the Latvian Presidency. There's been a lot of progress there. And you said, you mentioned need for speed. But are you a little bit worried it could be less need for speed and more the fast and the furious? Because it seems to me there's a lot of interesting positions to reconcile on things like copyright, for example.
So we'll come to copyright, but I think overall what Günther Oettinger often says is that there is a problem in the way the institutions operate now in doing legislation. And having sat in a perm rep myself, I think that at 28 in the council, it's really hard for middle-ranking officials to take risks and get speed going. In the parliament, I think they are better at it. If you look at the speed with which they've adopted a very controversial report on copyright precisely this week, I think the Parliament can do speed. The Council has to show that it can. The Commission is a master of speed.
Of course. Perfect. And so thinking about this going through the Council, I mean, you've got the Luxembourg presidency coming up. I think that could be quite interesting. Do you see any, because we've got a lot of people from the perm reps in the audience, are there any particular countries who you'd like to give particular messages to while you're up here?
Well, I was thinking, looking at the chart, of course, we now have 28 member states in the European Union. It's about the size of a primary school class, and you don't motivate any classroom by saying, Johnny is number 1 and you're 28. Governments need to see where they rank, but actually every country has a a good thing or two to say about where they are on the digital journey. So I wouldn't personally, even in private, start pointing fingers at member states. I think, having been in Luxembourg with the Prime Minister, Mr. Bettel, for a digital conference just 10 days ago, I think the Luxembourg presidency will be hugely good news, because we have the digital minister who's also the Prime Minister. We have a country that is really wanting to be world-class in things like fintech, finance, IT, which is making it easy for people to come into Luxembourg to work on those issues, not just from within Europe, but from every country. So I'm looking for a very open, dynamic Luxembourg presidency, and that will enable everybody else to show their strengths.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, because we saw a lot of the stats up here about people having concerns about, doing business cross-border, where, of course, the joy of the internet is that it knows no borders. It should be just as easy for me to buy a pair of shoes in Bulgaria as a handbag from France. Do you feel this kind of lesson learning, this kind of exchange? How have you been looking after that process in the Commission?
Well, I think that the idea of boosting cross-border shopping and cross-border business offers has been core to the digital agenda since I started this job in 2010, and it's one of the issues where, frankly, we haven't been hitting our targets. And I think the reasons were up there on the screen. SMEs and citizens alike somehow fear that it gets too complicated. And if you think about why, when you go online and you want to buy a washing machine, the search engine doesn't only take you to your own country, but that's the first problem. Secondly, it will probably select out the Bulgarian language offers if I'm asking the question in English. So the multilingual DSM is a problem. And then I might want to buy my washing machine in a foreign language from another country, and the website will kick me off because my credit card comes up with a Belgian address. So that's the geo-blocking problem. And so I think that we need to get into a more virtuous spiral where we can overcome the language barrier, we overcome the contract law barrier, we overcome the geo-blocking barrier, and then people will find that the water is lovely and more people will get in.
Oh, super. Let's come back to geo-blocking and copyright in a moment, but let me ask a little bit more about payment systems, because that's something you raise with credit cards and things. Apple Pay just coming to Europe with great fanfare. Is this something, this is another American company coming over saying, like, guys, we've got this payment product. A lot of European SMEs have been trying to tackle this for a while. How do you feel about them turning up?
So I think everybody should come. This has never been a fortress Europe. It says in the treaty we want to grow together so it helps the world economy to grow. And I think that's the Founding Fathers' vision that we're still true to. Mr. Ansip went to Washington to allay fears in Washington. We're in Beijing and we're in Pretoria and we're in Delhi allaying fears. So there is no worry about third country operators coming in to offer nice things to European firms and citizens, as long as they do it in a fair way. That's Mrs. Vestaga's business. In terms of payments, I think we're in a sort of innovation phase where lots of people are trying different solutions. You can do your banking on your laptop. In some countries, you can do your payments with your smartphone. So it's not only Apple Pay, you have your telephone subscriber, you have your online banking. And I think that little by little, we will find that these payment systems converge. Interoperability is a big goal, and that's what we've said in the strategy. So we want to avoid that anybody tries to lock down the market at a time when we're trying to work out what is the right balance between ease of payment and, as people were saying yesterday on this stage, security.
Great, perfect. So I'm doing my online shopping, I've put my credit card in, I'm getting super excited about my new shoes, then comes the tax line, and this tax is completely different to what I was expecting. Why is this VAT rate different? What are your thoughts on the tax matter?
So tax, of course, as a bureaucrat, I should say it's not my business, but we brought out this week something on corporate tax, and I'd like to start there. So Mr. Juncker added a word to our policy vocabulary last year, which is fairness, so growth and jobs and fairness. And he has very much made fair tax part of the deal. So corporate taxation is what most people first think of, and Mr. Dombrovskis came out yesterday with some ideas on that. On the VAT point, I think we're at a sort of, we're at a moment when what's normal in the market is about to change again. When I was really young, you used to have everything quoted as prices before tax in some countries, and then we all got onto VAT, and now it's all sort of tax-paid prices. At a time when online the prices may vary, I think we're going to get back to being used to seeing a price which says without VAT, and which will then maybe say to you, and if you're living in country X, as we can see, then the VAT rate is X, so your tax-paid price is different from the tax-paid price in another member state. But I don't think that matters, because we're all just living in one place at one time. So we're getting now to a world where VAT can vary without creating an obstacle to business across borders.
Okay, that's interesting. But then the burden is back on the consumer, right? Because it's up to them to know that it's going to be different. Do you not? I mean, I would worry that possibly the consumers will see that and be like, the EU has made me pay more tax, or cross.
Well, I don't think the EU is making you pay more tax. I mean, at the moment, what's happening, of course, is that we arbitrage the other way. So for online products, is the audience really interested in this, boys and girls? So for online products, you pay the country of origin VAT rate. So if you know a country which sells bedspreads at 0 rate and you're living in London at 21%, you can buy it somewhere else. I personally think we're going to go to a world where everything will follow the VATMOS solution, which is only for the immaterial goods, where the country of destination will determine the tax. Mm-hmm. And you say, but then the burden is on the consumer. Actually not. I mean, there's nothing to stop big data tools from delivering for the SME and for the consumer the tax-paid price on the basis of where the consumer lives. So the consumer gets a single price. They then have to pay it, and let's say the SME that's selling to them also has an online tool which distributes the tax in the right way at the end of the month between the different national treasuries. So I think this is an area where digital has actually removed a transaction cost that existed 30 years ago and which was at the root of the decision to harmonize tax rates. So that's a very long, techie answer, but that's where we're going. We're going to online tax definition, online tax resolution, which will enable member states actually not to say, oh, the EU is fiddling with my tax, but to say, whatever tax I'm facing, my local government decided it.
Great. Okay, all right,
that's good. One problem less for Brussels.
Yeah, lovely. All right, so the internet's making things smoother, people are better informed, more internet is going to fix all of our problems. I love it. All right, so if you're not sure that the audience is keen on VAT, I know, having a quick peek at the Twitter wall, they are very keen on copyright. So let's talk about geo-blocking. I printed out my favorite bits of the DSM here. And I'm very interested in this concept of justified and unjustified geo-blocking. Right. Can you kind of spell it out for us?
Right. So geo-blocking is I can't get access to what I want based on where I live. Mm-hmm. We put the word unjustified in to signal that we weren't proposing that in law geo-blocking should always and everywhere be prohibited. For example, if in country A online gambling is allowed and in country B it is prohibited, it would be important that in country B a citizen is geo-blocked from consuming in country A, if that's the choice of the government of country B. So that would be justified geo-blocking. But the question is, and how many more examples can you find, Robert? And that's the question which is political. In other words, we're going to find out in the legislative process what we decide as a matter of policy in Europe in the 21st century is justified and what is not justified. A priori, and Mr. Ansip is very strong on this, we would say that unjustified geo-blocking is where it's just enabling people to do for immaterial goods what they used to do before the single market came along for everything else. And that's a bad thing for citizens. So if it's just enabling people to carve up the market and make bigger profits, probably that's unjustified. If it's for a public interest goal, probably it's justified. But We have a debate ahead on that.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And in terms of copyright, so, you know, the classic soap opera example, which I'm sure Mr. Ansip would be giving us if he were here, or, you know, I try to watch Game of Thrones in whichever country, and it says, no, you can't see it. How do you see the role of the intermediaries, of copyright collecting societies, of the platforms? You know, how can they make this happen once you decide what needs to happen?
So this is not 1789. We're not going around trying to cut everybody's head off, and intermediaries in the copyright field are not addressed in the proposal. There has been work on the roles of collective rights management. There's a directive out there. We'll see how it goes, but that's not the issue this year. The issue this year is rather, how do we condition the legal construct that is copyright? Do we tackle different exceptions? Do we look at access to knowledge differently? And on cross-border consumption of cultural goods for payment, so not piracy, do we make it possible, A, to have portability, and B, to have cross-border consumption? Portability means I have a subscription to something in Belgium, I travel to London, can I still consume it? That's not self-evident, but we think that's a no-brainer. And slightly more tricky in different flavors is, if I can't get what I want in Belgium, can I get it off a website that's in London without breaching the fundamental approach of territorial exclusivity? And frankly, my answer would be yes, that would be logical. What will happen? There'll be an end to this sort of absurd price arbitrage, so prices will slightly align, but not necessarily completely align, but people will still get money. And since I'm only going to consume it once, if I'm an extra customer in London instead of an extra customer in Belgium, who cares? You know, the rights owner still gets my money.
Yeah, that's the important thing, definitely, that you have a platform set up in a way that people can legally get the content they want. A joyous journey that I personally am going on when I become freelance and all my stuff pops up all over the place. I'm like, what's even going on with the rights here? Quite intriguing. Okay, maybe we should talk about platforms for a moment, because, you know, I go on YouTube, I go on Netflix, I go on, you know, all kinds of different platforms, but they do have the common factor that most of them are from the States. Do you want to see a European platform emerge? What are you doing to create the European version of our favorite video sharing websites?
So the joy of the free market is that people like me are not paid to create what's on the market. Innovators are paid to create what's on the market if they innovate successfully, otherwise they go bust as well. So no, Europe does not have a policy which says, can we build a Euro Google at the taxpayer's expense? What I think we're trying to do, as we've said for some years, is to get people to start commercializing the great European innovations in Europe, and then enable them to go on growing in a bigger single market so that they stay in Europe. Whether or not we need another video platform, I don't know. Whether or not we need a better film archive at European level, maybe. We have Europeana out there as an attempt to put online access to cultural goods more easily within people's reach. But even there, public archives at national level have the same sort of territorial access problems sometimes that the commercial archives have.
Yeah. Do you have a policy which is, let's get out the way, which is a bit of an executive summary of what many see Mr. Timmermans' role as being? Just kind of gently back off, hands off, let things flourish?
No, maybe I was too laissez-faire. What we want to do is create the conditions. And in the other part of my life, apart from doing the regulatory space, we do ICT research, development, innovation. So we spend over $1 billion a year trying to make public-private partnerships to grow European success. In my area, it would be robotics, the next generation of chips, big data, the Internet of Things, connected cars, and so on. So we have a very clear industrial strategy to grow Europe's productive capacity through innovation, especially digital innovation. That's clear. That's interventionist, and by the way, if anybody could get the state aid rules out of the way so we'd have more better investment, including in broadband, that would be a plus. What Mr. Timmermans is speaking to, I think, is regulatory forbearance, and I personally think that the Timmermans package is the best ever platform for good rulemaking that we've had in Europe at national or at EU level in decades. And I think it's got a very powerful toolbox, self-regulation, co-regulation, impact assessment right at the beginning, lots of consultation. So there's a lot of good news there. But in the end, government still has to take decisions. Government is a decision machine. So at the European level, we have to decide what to do on the basis of the data available, not waiting and waiting and waiting. And next year, we shall be deciding in all of our 16 action areas what we propose. So I think the Timmermans stuff is very good, professionalizes decision-making, doesn't reduce decision-making.
Fantastic. A Dutchman with a big toolbox. It sounds like the beginning of a great film. Perfect. Twittermeister, how are we doing? Have you got any questions from over here?
Yes, so we are around 100 unique tweets already within these 30 minutes, so
wow,
which is a very
that is good so soon after breakfast. I'm impressed, guys.
Basically, people are talking about all the topics. The geo-blocking and copyright, I would say, was the highlight. For example, Ulla Gilberg saying that where Robert Madelin touches upon e-commerce, copyright and tax, interesting hard talk. On the other hand, Razvan Antemir is saying that's much a softer version of hard talk. How about reducing administrative burdens? So this is for already the first question. And then we have more questions to come. So Kyrillis Solvoyos is asking, fair tax, like fair use, seems like a very vague proposition. What does it mean? So it's the second, let's say. And then the third question, which I picked up, was sent by Ben Butters, asking, given the need for policy to keep up with rapid market and tech evolution and slow EU lawmaking, can co-self-regulation play a greater role?
All right, lots of things to bounce off there.
Yeah, I don't promise to remember all of those. Let me start with the last one.
I can repeat them.
Yeah.
Fine, yeah.
So if I start with the last one, I think personally, the cycle time of legislation will never match innovation.
Yeah.
And having been a bureaucrat for 30-odd years, I think that's a good thing. You know, we do not want to go back to the 19th century solution in the country I know best, where everybody said, yes, let's have the motor car, and we have a man with a red flag walking in front of the motor car at no more than 4 miles an hour, 100 yards in front of the motor car. And so 150 years ago, that was what they debated in the House of Commons. We don't want that. And so I think that law will not get in the way of innovation, but co-regulation can help to shape stuff that's moving fast. It can help to deliver stuff faster than legislators can, and it can then iterate more rapidly as well. So I really believe that co-regulation, as set out in the Timmermans package, is a big new opportunity. The other question was about the fair use. Fair use is an American legal concept in copyright. We don't have to copy the Americans, and even the Rader report, if I put it like that, the one that's just been adopted in committee in the Parliament, doesn't talk about fair use. So we don't necessarily want to copy a fair use doctrine in EU copyright law. What I think we do want, in the area specifically of text and data mining, for example, is to enable European researchers to have legal certainty that they can access big piles of data and find new things in them. Great example, if you take 50,000 learned articles around the metabolization of iron in the human body, you find 3 or 4 new life-saving ideas which were not in the original material. And so you're actually creating something new. It's like a mashup, it's like user-generated content. We have to open the road for researchers to do that.
Fantastic. Okay, it's very interesting. And then in terms of need for speed, let me just very cheekily ask, are we on track to have the copyright proposal by the end of this year still?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Also, another need for speed question. Let me ask about the telecom single market, or the bits that are left of it, like net neutrality and spectrum. Now, you're a historian. Yesterday, we had this lovely reception in the Railway Museum, and I was thinking, isn't it a bit true that spectrum is like the railways and data are like the trains of our new economy, like in the 19th century with the railways? Are you worried about what the spectrum and the net neutrality stuff is going to look like by the end of this process?
So that's a great analogy. And if you take it one step further, there was a lot of corruption and fighting in London about how you cleared the way to put the tracks down so that the railway could arrive at the station. I think the analogy suggests to me that, yes, spectrum is a common good, like space in a big city in the 19th century. Its value has been completely transformed by the coming of the Internet of Things, and the people who are sitting where the railway needs to go, and in this case it's the police, the armed forces, the emergency services in general, they say, I want to keep my spectrum, and I want to use it the way I've always used it. I want this whole band to be kept free in case there's a Third World War. And the new technology can say to them, well, if there is a Third World War or you think there's a risk of it, we'll give it back to you. It can be like a fire lane on an American highway. But in the meantime, can we please use it for mobile? And I think that those sorts of spectrum sharing techniques are going to be hugely powerful. But before we get there, we actually need to harmonize some bands across Europe quickly so that connected cars can drive from here to Seville without needing 150 different radio frequency antennae in each of their SIM cards. So I think that there's a lot to be done to harmonize bits of spectrum. But what we are not doing, and I say that in the town where we have the BEREC, the Office of the Telecom Regulators, what we are not going to do is propose that it all be managed out of Robert's office in Brussels. So we need better coordinated, faster to market decision making. We need some harmonized use, but we do not need a single euro anything to be created.
Okay, perfect. So sharing is caring, but you're not going to enforce that sharing through a single European regulator.
Caring, sharing, but let's do it fast.
Great, lovely, perfect. Guys, I don't know if we could put the lights up, if there's anybody who's dying to ask any questions in the audience, having taken a few from Twitter. All right, I see a very keen chap in the middle there. I don't know if we can get you a microphone, or you can just stand up and use your loudest voice. Here we are, perfect. So, sir, tell us very briefly who you are, who you're with, and then, like I say, super quick question.
Hello, thank you. I'm Ola Landström from the Swedish National Board of Trade. I have a question regarding geo-blocking and what is to be considered and justified. I find it interesting that just making a profit would be considered unjustified, since that's what companies do. They're out to make a profit, and just making a profit to me is a justified reason for a company. I think there's some confusion as to what is to be considered geo-blocking. You have two types of geo-blocking, basically. One where you block the consumer entirely, and you have another one where you have different prices for different markets. And what is to be considered a question of simply supply and demand, and what is to be considered discriminatory is more complicated than that, I think. I would also like to ask how this matter should be addressed, if it is to be with competition law or within the confines of the Services Directive.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
What are we going to get out of the toolbox for it?
So if I start with the last part first, there are many more than two vehicles to achieve this. As we say in English, there's more than one way to skin a cat. So there's the Services Directive, there's the E-commerce Directive, there's consumer protection rules, there's competition rules. So how we're going to do it is a secondary question. On your first remarks, I think what we're living around geo-blocking is a double paradox in the digital age. The first paradox is we're used to what is fair in our local markets, and we now need to think about what is local. And the second is that it may well be profitable for a company to do A or B or C online, and we have to revisit the question whether we tolerate it or not. In many cases, I think what's going on online is what has been going on for the last hundreds of years in the real world markets, and progressively we've understood that price gouging, forced selling, vertical restraints, these are all bad things, and people seem to think that the internet is a parallel universe and they can get away with stuff that they've known to be criminal if they do it in a high street shop for decades. So I think that how we address this is partly a question of applying established principles and partly a question of revisiting what we think is fair. You said, shall we say that it's unjustified to make a profit? Of course not. But not everything that is profitable is tolerated under competition or consumer protection law in Europe today. And the question is, what should we tolerate and what should we allow online tomorrow? So do we want to force somebody in a Scottish island who knits sweaters to have a website offering them for sale in all the other community languages? We do not. Do we think it's fair that a large retailer refuses to sell, even sometimes within member states, outside the area that's nice and easy to sell to? No, we probably don't. But part of the solution is not with the retailer. Part of the solution is with the quality of universal service we expect citizens to get on the European Union territory for parcel delivery. That's a public policy problem. And we may therefore need to revisit, not only in the telecom package, but also in the work Mrs. Biankowska is doing on parcel post, the question, what is a universal service for small enterprises and citizens living outside the well-served, densely populated, nearly urban areas of Europe? So that's more a sort of social and regional policy question. But I think that we have to look openly and with quite fresh eyes at what we think is fair, and then decide how we legislate for it. So I don't think geo-blocking in that respect is different from other issues that we've raised in the digital single market. We need in a way, we need a big conversation to decide what we want to deliver for our citizens in the 21st century.
Let me ask about something which ties in with a lot of the questions you've just been discussing about. It is profitable. Is it useful for traffic? What is a universal service? Net neutrality. A lot of those sounded like very similar arguments. Do you know what this might look like by the end? Because, you know, this has been kind of going on. We've got the parliament. Will we ever see this net neutrality legislation? What do you want to do? Yeah.
Yeah. So if I go back to 2010, when I started in this job, there was no agreement whether there were problems in the real world around the issues of net neutrality. BEREC, again, back to the network of regulators headquartered in this town, did some research, and we found, yep, there are quite a lot of B2C, B2B problems that people report in terms of throttling of speeds, failure to get access, dropped or frozen video, where people think that the reason is that the service they're trying to consume may be in competition with services that their connectivity provider wants them to consume. Mm-hmm. And so that would be an abuse of technological positioning, and it's that sort of bad practice we want to squeeze out in the net neutrality rules that are now before the Parliament and Council. We do not want to squeeze out the right of businesses to innovate, and so, for example, personally, I think that the prohibition of zero rating is it's a false good idea, because it would be like saying you cannot offer bread for free in any restaurant in Europe. There are some restaurant cultures around Europe where you pay a cover charge, you pay for your bread, and there are others where you get the bread for free. So zero rating is the same. There are some subscriptions where you get Facebook for free if you're interested in it, and others where you would pay for that data. And I think, therefore, we're trying not to create a hard and fast principle, an absolutist approach to something called neutrality, but rather to define what we know is a society we want to prohibit and what we want to allow. And if we can at least get a deal, which is what we want, with the Latvian presidency's help, by the summer, people will then be much more certain how they can innovate in the next 5 years than they have been in the last 5 years.
Perfect. So a good, healthy dose of British pragmatism. I like it a lot. Now, I know there's a question which isn't popping up on the Twitter wall, but a lot of people in the audience have come up and asked me if I will ask you. So it should probably be the last question. Can I ask about your summer holiday plans and what you might be doing after them?
So my summer holiday plans, don't tell the polar bears. I'm going to go to Svalbard and try and find a polar bear.
Oh,
that's my summer holiday plans. What am I going to do after them? I shall do whatever is in the interests of the service. I mean, the European Commission is a public service, and so we go where we're told, when we're told, and we might not be told until the day before we have to go. So the last time I changed jobs, I first had an inkling of it on the 12th of March, and I was in my new job on the 1st of April. In this case, what President Juncker has said to all senior officials is, he said in March, by the end of June I will decide, and then in September you'll know what you're doing. And this week we were told that next week, yes, so before the end of June, there'll be a decision. What the decision is, nobody knows. So everybody thinks, yes, but you know really, don't you, Robert? And the answer is no, nobody knows anything until it's decided. I think people in my position, we have to trust the system. People know what we're good at, what we're not good at, what we'd like to do, what we wouldn't like to do. So I trust the system.
Mm-hmm. Very noble. But, you know, it's like when I worked at the paper, trusting the system, you know, you could end up on, say, like the sports desk, which would be my personal idea of hell, or you can end up on the tech desk, which would be amazing and super good fun. So you don't have a little personal preference deep down inside?
Well, that may be true, but it's deep down inside.
Okay, not for sharing then. Brilliant. Robert, thank you so much. You've done a superb job of standing in at the last moment. I've certainly learned a lot this morning. I hope the audience have as well. So thank you so much for coming in. And yes, good luck with your last few weeks before going polar bear spotting.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vivienne.